From Rashad Evans getting knocked out in the first round to Masvidal's recent announcement, these are UFC fighters who retired after one loss. In the high-stakes world of the UFC, sometimes all it takes is one loss to send a fighter into retirement. Although our first fighter suffered a few losses on the tail end of his career, when a loss is just so devastating, it puts things into perspective. Once hailed as one of the top light heavyweights on the planet, former UFC light heavyweight champion Rashad Evans decided to call it quits in 2018 after one loss too many. Sure, it's arguable that Suga stuck around for too long as his career ended after 5 consecutive losses, but it isn't as bad as it sounds, considering 2 of his final 3 bouts ended in split decisions. But Evans' final loss was indisputable, which was a crushing defeat at the hands of future title challenger Anthony Smith, who knocked the legend out in just 53 seconds in the first round. Yeah, that'll kill a man's motivation. Unfortunately notorious for his now weak chin, it was clear after that fight that Evans could no longer hack it with the world's best. So, less than a month after the loss, Evans hung up his gloves for good. In another world, who knows if Evans would have retired had the fight gone differently, but it was clear he was at the tail end of his fighting career. And while there hasn't been any talk of a comeback since his retirement, it's likely for the best. Evans spent 14 years fighting in the UFC and, as of now, enjoys a successful career as a UFC analyst for ESPN broadcasts. Moving on to another legend of the sport, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, also known as Minotauro, and that's a cool fighting name. Nogueira is considered one of the greatest heavyweights in MMA history, with a storied career in Pride before moving to the UFC. While he did provide some classic moments in the octagon, he was never quite the same fighter he was in his prime. Nogueira had a total of 11 fights in the UFC, and he ended up retiring in 2015 after his final loss to Stefan Struve. This loss was the last in a run of 3 losses, which was the worst run on his record. Although he managed to last the distance with the giant Dutchman, it was clear that his best days were behind him. And even if the fight ended a different way, age was becoming a noticeable factor. Damn that pesky father time. There were also rumors that he had lost sight in one of his eyes, due to the accumulation of damage he'd taken over his career, and he'd suffered severe injuries to his hips and right arm as well. After retiring, Nogueira was offered a job with the UFC in public relations, and was later inducted into the UFC's Hall of Fame, which was a fitting end to his legendary career. It's always tough to see a fighter retire, especially after just one loss, but sometimes the decision is the right one. The Minotaur spent 8 years fighting in the UFC and will always be remembered as a formidable fighter. And when it comes to formidable, our next fighter was the epitome of that in her prime. Ronda was the biggest and most bankable star in the UFC in mid-2015, but by December 2016, she had retired following 2 devastating losses to Holly Holm and Amanda Nunes. Wow, a lot can happen in a year. Rousey's loss to Nunes in particular was crushing. She attempted to stand with Nunes, not the brightest idea, who simply destroyed her with a flurry of punches in the first minute of the opening round. It was a terrible loss. That was always going to be hard to bounce back from, and it didn't come as too much of a surprise when her retirement was announced, only next year in 2017. Along with her move to WWE, it felt like Rowdy Ronda simply couldn't deal with the fallout from those losses, while also not being able to adapt her fighting game with the new women's talent coming through, and chose to walk away instead. Her loss to Holm had been a devastating knockout, but there was still the feeling amongst a lot of fans that she could get back to the top if she went back to the judo-based style that had given her so much success. She had won 6 straight UFC title defenses after all. However, against Nunes, she was never given the chance to bounce back, and it was a tough pill to swallow for Rousey. Unlike many on this list, it's pretty clear this loss was the reason for Rousey's retirement. And if she managed to beat Nunes, she would have won the bantamweight title back. And it's hard to imagine she would just give it away. Since then, Rousey has been inducted into the UFC's Hall of Fame, a fine endorsement of her legendary career prior to her 2 losses. She has also found success in the world of professional wrestling, but it's clear that her time in the UFC is now over. Although Rousey only fought in the UFC for 3 years, she made a giant impact on the women's division, and it can be argued she took women's UFC to new heights. Another iconic figure in MMA history is the Natural himself, Randy Couture. Despite Couture's illustrious career, Couture wasn't always able to maintain his winning ways, and was actually one of the few UFC legends to retire twice in the promotion, both times off the back of losses. Probably should have learned the first time, hey Randy? The first time Couture retired came in 2006, after he was knocked out by Chuck Liddell for the second time, in a failed attempt to regain his light heavyweight title. The Iceman put him on ice. And at the age of 42, it felt like Couture had nothing more to prove, and retiring made perfect sense, and was even quickly inducted into the UFC's Hall of Fame a few months later. But just over a year later, Couture was back in the octagon facing Tim Sylvia for the UFC heavyweight title, and in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, Captain America pulled off the win at the age of 43 to win the gold, defying all logic. But the fairy tale ended soon after, with Couture eventually losing the title to Brock Lesnar in November 2008 after a protracted absence from the octagon due to an infamous contract dispute. He went on to have a few more fights before retiring for good after being knocked out by Lyoto Machida in incredible fashion. Since retiring from the UFC, Couture has moved to rival promotion Bellator MMA, but hasn't returned to action again. Couture spent 14 years fighting in the UFC, and it's hard to say if his last knockout defeat was the main reason for retirement, but it's always tough to see a legend retire, especially after a brutal loss. Looking to a much more wholesome retirement, despite it ending in a loss, was Jorge Masvidal's retirement earlier in the year. Masvidal announced his retirement after his 4th successive defeat, which was a one-sided decision loss to Gilbert Burns. The 38-year-old had hinted that he would retire from fighting if he lost to Burns before their fight, and that he did. Masvidal was looking to pick up his first win in over 2 years in front of a hometown Miami crowd, but Burns was too much for him that night. In his post-fight interview, Masvidal took off his gloves and admitted that he doesn't have the same love for fighting that he had at the start of his career. He thanked his fans and the UFC for inspiring him to chase his dreams. But it was clear that retirement was the right decision for him. It's always tough to see a fighter retire, especially legends of the sport, who were once seen as untouchable. But it's always important for fighters to prioritize their health and well-being, and to know when it's time to hang up their gloves for good. So, from Masvidal's final farewell to Evans' crushing defeat, these were UFC fighters who retired after one loss.